Employers today expect students to have strong analytical skills and an understanding of emerging technologies. I'm Mike Brown, a senior instructor for Becker, a proud sponsor of the 2021 IMA Student Conference. I'm so glad you're attending, and while you're here, make sure to visit Becker's virtual booth to learn about our solutions that can help you thrive in this ever-changing industry, and take advantage of exclusive pricing on CMA exam review and professional development. Now, please join Dr. Kimberly Church for Develop an Analytics Mindset as she discusses the role data analytics plays in accounting and finance and how it can help you. Thank you, and enjoy the session.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Church from Missouri State University. I'm currently the director and the BKD professor of leadership. Primarily, my responsibility right now is helping Missouri State University get our curriculum updated for data analytics. That means I'm helping prepare students for the accounting profession of the future. When we think about where we were just 5 years ago, we look at many articles that existed in 2017, and they were really telling us that the accounting profession was ready for its demise. So when we look at these articles from 2017, we realize that the accounting profession has done a lot to change just in the last 5 years. And we've risen to that challenge. Just 5 years ago, they were telling us that things like automation were going to replace accountants of the future. We looked at functions like bookkeeping, clerical jobs, and tax preparation. Automation was going to remove those from the accounting profession entirely. When we look at jobs like accountants for private accounting firms, or for auditors, or for tax examiners, nearly half of those jobs were going to be gone as a result of automation. Thankfully, much like the phoenix that rises out of the ashes, we've redefined ourselves in a very short period of time. And we found that we have evolved each of the items that we do or the tasks that we perform, and we've embraced this automation and technology to broaden the scope of the value that we add to companies. So when we think about the difference between a bookkeeper and an accountant and why a bookkeeper might be automated, whereas an accountant wouldn't, we really need to focus on the foundation of the very essence of those definitions. When we look at what a bookkeeper is someone who just performs systematic record keeping of monetary transactions. Much of that can be automated through general ledger systems that we have today. But when we think about the pure definition of an accountant, what are they really? We find that data analytics fits that definition really quite perfectly. We are the profession of data analytics. We analyze the financial position of a company, and we look at the results of that to perform consulting or make recommendations on how we can improve business operations and strategy to help businesses better perform. And that's what we're preparing ourselves for, which is a career in accounting. So what does that change look like? So when we think about what accounting was just those 5 short years ago, we really emphasized the strategy or the preparing information for decision making. But we've expanded well beyond that now. Now what we're doing is creating unicorns. So each of you is going to be a unicorn. When you graduate, you're going to have expanded your skills in the accounting profession. So not only will you have the business and accounting acumen that most of us had 5 years ago, where you're learning the nuts and bolts of accounting, we're also going to expand your knowledge in emerging technologies and develop the analytic skills you need to become data-driven decision makers. Now we move on to what actually data analytics is. Some of you may have been exposed to data analytics already in your short career as a student. When we think about data analytics, we have to think about the amount of data that we are exposed to on a daily basis. And that's really what's creating the foundation for this evolution or revolution in accounting. So when we think about each day and the data around us, and we think about how we want to define data analytics specifically to our profession, we think about the sheer enormity of the data that surrounds us. And this is a result of a lot of the emerging technologies that surround us. So each day, each of you on average is producing 1.7 megabytes of data every second. Can you imagine that? That means around the globe, We're creating nearly 2.5 quintillions of data daily. By the way, in case you're not familiar, a quintillion has 18 zeros. 90% of the world's data was just created in the last 2 years, especially during the pandemic when many of us were at home trying to work remotely. That created an enormous amount of data between the social media posts that we were doing to try to stay connected with the outside world, as well as the business that we took home to work remotely. This leads us to the need for data insight and, frankly, advancements in technology to create the processing ability to look at this enormous amount of data. So where does this data come from? Well, what we really have is a data disruption, and it's impacting every profession, not just accounting. But accounting is not going to be immune from it. So we're going to have to embrace it. What you see here on the picture now is the data that we used to analyze. It really focused a lot on the accounting or the corporate data. It focused a lot on the internal data, looking at both the managerial and the financial reporting data. We emphasize strategy, but more from an internal perspective, using the methods and tools that helped us take advantage of our insider information by being inside the firm. What we found is that this data has evolved. And thanks to the Internet of Things, it's really driving a data explosion. So we were used to looking at the internal data, but what we want to start looking at now is external data. That's the data that's going to drive new and innovative insight in our space of accounting so that we can begin to drive decision making. And this is going to come from places like monitoring systems, RFID, looking at sensors, looking at interesting weather patterns and how that impacts our business models, looking at data about the populations around us, scraping the web for social media posts, for sentiment analysis. We're going to be looking at public data that's publicly available and typically free. We're also going to look at things like commercial data that we can purchase to couple with our internal data to try to elicit insight out of this very interesting intersection of data revolution. It should be noted that dark data represents about 90% of a firm's data. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing just because we say dark data and we think of it being in the basement of the building. Sometimes dark data just means we have, and it's such an enormous amount of data coming at us, but there's no way for the technology we have today or even our human brain to process all of this data. So a lot of times it'll go dark, meaning that it becomes irrelevant. We lose that timeliness factor because we just couldn't get to it in time to elicit some type of insight from it. Also, it can contain metadata, and that's something you want to familiarize yourself with also. Metadata is the data about data. So when I logged onto my computer this morning, I logged on to my email, I logged on to a couple of systems that I needed to perform tasks, and I also logged into Excel and PowerPoint to work on some of the tasks that I have for the day. Well, I used those applications, but what I didn't realize was behind the scenes, those applications were collecting data about me. They were collecting who logged into the system, what time did they log in, how long did they stay logged in, what did they open and close, did I connect to another network? So metadata is all that data that's being collected behind the scenes, and we're beginning to move into an environment where data analytics is even including the concept of process mining, which is data analytics on metadata. So we're now doing analytics on the data about data. So you can see data analytics is here to stay. So this introduces us to kind of the concept of this enormity, the sheer enormity or tsunami of data that's coming at us. Well, how can we define all of this data that's coming at us so that I can begin to think about innovative ways to integrate things with my current internal data? What we want to do is look at the 5 characteristics of data. We call these the 5 Bs. And I'm going to actually introduce a 6th B to you because I believe there's 6 Bs. But we're going to start with this model here. When we think about the volume of data, again, we're looking at the sheer enormity, the amount of data from sources. So much like Facebook that has billions of messages posted each day. We also have the variety of data. Data can be both structured and unstructured. Should be noted that about 80% of data is unstructured. So when we think about unstructured data, a lot of times we're thinking about videos or audio files or photos. Some of that can be difficult to convert into a data analytics format, but it can be done. Another thing to look at is the veracity. Veracity is the degree of reliability of data, the filters, the ability to translate, the unstructured data. So we want to structure unstructured data to elicit insight, and that can be done when we look at something like a photo versus GPS coordinates. And so we look at a photo, but we know if we look at the metadata on that photo, there's GPS coordinates that we can use to locate something on a map. And we can elicit that insight when we're scraping social media posts, trying to help a company maybe emerge into a new market. Another one to look at is value, and that's really the trustworthiness of the data. And we look at that for insight when we're processing, but we also want to make sure that we recognize that the sheer enormity of the data creates storage issues, and these storage issues can be expensive. So when we're looking at data, we also want to be mindful of the cost benefit analysis. Just because we can collect the data and just because we can use the data doesn't mean we really should be, because sometimes it costs too much money to store the data to use it for further insight down the road. So we want to be careful about that value concept. That's why you'll see some companies will do a purge of their data every 2 weeks, and it's just to make room for new data to elicit new insight. The fifth V that we look at is velocity, and velocity is simply the data on demand. It's the ability to have data at our fingertips at all times. So when you think about something like social media, the idea of velocity is just thinking about posting something on social media and then the fact that it goes viral. So when your post goes viral, you have velocity of data because you've made that post available to everyone instantaneously. Now I'm going to add a sixth V to the data characteristics, and this is one that you want to really have on your radar for down the road. It's coming, and that evolving sixth V is called vulnerability. Vulnerability of data is important because it's going to involve privacy of personal data, and those laws are already in place. We know that the EU has privacy rules, and that's why a lot of times when you get on websites now, you see something like, do you accept our cookies? We can really thank the EU for doing that, the European Union, because they have their privacy and personal data laws are actually a little bit ahead of us here in the US. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about data ethics. So what's happening in the profession right now, and what's really driving this change? When we look at what's happening in the profession, we're looking at the fact that automation of basic accounting functions have really required us to evolve into data-driven decision makers. The accounting knowledge that we have helps us couple with this data to provide insights on the relationships between many of the accounting variables or business variables that we're familiar with that not everyone knows, and we use that for analysis. That's what makes us as accountants about true value add to the company. And when we think back to the slide that had the unicorn on it, that's what's going to differentiate us from other people in data analytics in a business environment, is that we have the accounting acumen coupled with the data and analytics skill set. Now, what's happening in education? So what's really driving the knowledge share or how we're training the future accountants? Well, a lot of this is being driven by what's happening in the profession. So when you think about what's going on in education, we know that there are important competency frameworks, much like what the IMA has. Their competency framework has evolved in the technology area and the decision-making area to include data analytics competencies, the ability to perform the tasks and skills that we're going to talk about today. We also know that professional certifications, much like the CMA, are also including data analytics in their testing platforms. So we want to make sure that students are prepared for not only certification, but the profession of the future. Many of you attend universities that have accreditation. Those accrediting bodies are now requiring data analytics as part of that curriculum. So you should be introduced to data analytics, not only in a single course, but throughout your coursework. So let's look at data analytics best practices. When we think about how you can prepare yourself for the profession of the future, these are the things that you want to be conversant in. Then the idea is once you master a few of these, and that's okay to focus your competencies on just a few of these items, but you do want to be aware of each of their existence. And then once you decide which one's going to be your sweet spot, you want to drill down into that area and try to become a content expert on those various tasks that exist within each of those areas. So we're going to do a deep dive in each of the areas in logical and critical thinking, in types of data and the different things we do with data, models that are needed, how to do mining, analysis, visualization, storytelling, and then the ever-present and emerging area of data analytics ethics. When we look at critical thinking really is important for evaluating basically an awareness of your surroundings. So you want to make sure that you're aware of who your stakeholders are. So when we take on a data analytics task, or we want to perform a data analytics function, not only do we need to identify the scope of the project, but we also want to make sure we're aware of who our stakeholders are. We want to identify issues versus making recommendations for actions. So on the front end, we really want to ask the important questions. What is it that I want to pursue the data analytics project for? So it's going to be about question development and data identification. These items will be necessary to determine the method we want to use, the approach we're going to take to our data analytics project long before we ever apply anything. So long before we're ever analyzing data, we want to be thinking about how we're going to go about solving a problem. Talking to managers and determining what it is I need to know before I take on any project. You'll notice that this is both critical and logical thinking. So when you're thinking about logical thinking, you might want to think about if you've been introduced to the concept of SQL, if you've been using if-then statements in Excel. This logical thinking forces you to put data variables together and think about the relationships that they're going to have. What expectations do you have when you create an if-then statement? What expectations do you have when you're working with SQL and you're merging data? Python also does this because you have to think about what you want that data to do when you create a statement that's going to execute later. So critical thinking will be very important on the front end, identifying your questions and setting up your project long before you go through the task of collecting the data or analyzing. The next thing we want to think about is your data sources. We talked about earlier the data characteristics that we have within the accounting profession, the data that we'll be looking at. It's important to think about sources of data. We originally talked about the filter where we looked at internal data to elicit insight. Now we've expanded that scope to external data. External data can be very interesting. There's lots of places we can go to look for external data to merge with our financial data to elicit additional insight. So you can see the example here of Sobe Bikes. Sobe Bikes is one of my favorite companies to work with because a lot of us understand the concept of bike sharing or bike rentals if we've gone to visit another city. When you look at their financial data, from a financial perspective, we can see that they have bike rentals. We can use external data with that bike rental data to try to determine some type of insight. When I worked with another colleague at Washburn University, we worked with their management team to try to determine some answers to business decisions. The first semester when we worked with the Sobe Bike Group, we were able to determine if weather impacted their business model, if it impacted the financial data. As you can imagine, you would assume that if it was a rainy day, that they wouldn't necessarily have as many bike riders. However, the importance of this project was that the bike share system was tied in with the city's transportation system, meaning that they intended the bikes to be a substitute for the bus when people wanted to get somewhere faster and didn't want to have to take the entire bus route. So what they wanted to know is if the weather actually impacted their financial patterns, because they weren't sure if people were using the bikes for pleasure, which was off task, or if they were using it for a substitute for public transportation. in which case you still have to go to the grocery store even on a rainy day. So we were able to track that information. Also, this happened in a state where if you don't like the weather, you just wait 15 minutes and the weather will change. In the particular state we analyzed, wind was also a factor that we found once we determined when we were looking at weather. So when we looked at whether it rained or not that day. We looked at whether it was windy that day. We also looked at the temperature on that day to determine if we could elicit some insight on whether the bike was being used for pleasure or for transportation. Because in the state we were evaluating, it was normal to have a 25-mile-an-hour sustained wind, we actually found that bike ride was impacted more by the wind than it was other forms of weather or temperature. The next time we worked with the company, we worked with them and we used census data. So when we were using census data, we were looking to see if where they had put the bike hubs, and you can see the picture of a bike hub here on your screen, it's where all the bikes get put into the rack, and that's where the bike computers reset for the next customer. They wanted to determine if where the bike racks were actually adhered to their mission, where they were supposed to be a substitution for public transportation. We were able to use census data to see if people that were eligible for the free and reduced lunches at the school programs also had access to the same bike hub locations. What we determined was they actually didn't have any bike hubs in the area where it would have been a substitute for transportation. And so because of the insight that the students found, they were able to move those bike hubs to areas that really fit the mission of the transportation system for the city. We also used GPS data, and that's a project that was really exciting for me to observe my colleague perform with her students, was when they used the GPS data, they could map where the bike had been, and the city actually wanted to know if people were using the bikes more for recreation or more for transportation. So by using the GPS data on the bike, they could map each of the routes each bike had taken, and they were able to determine what % of the bikes were used to go around the little city lake or versus the ones that were used to go from an apartment complex into maybe a grocery store or someplace, a discount store like Dollar General or Walgreens or Walmart. Those were actually substitutes for transportation versus the ones that went around the lake where they were used for recreation. And that enabled the city to go back to their grant and say what % were actually a substitute. So in that case, you could see we were able to merge financial data with 3 very interesting and very different sources of data. US public census data that was free for us to evaluate, using Google Maps, GPS coordinate data, and then going to the NOAA website and using US weather data. And I will tell you, weather data is not for the faint of heart. There are a million ways to look at temperature, at weather changes, at wind speeds, at precipitation for the day. And so you really have to dig in and decide which one's going to fit the business question that you have. Very important part of data analysis. Next item that we want to look at is modeling. Modeling is also a very important part of data analytics. This is where we're going to set up basically the relationship that we imply exists between each of the different types of data that we want to look at. Many of you have taken an information systems course, and you may have been exposed to a form of data modeling that we use in accounting. Data modeling is very important for looking at relationships that exist between data. So modeling isn't always statistical, but it can be. So you may be evaluating a statistical model. You may also be evaluating an economic model, or in this case, you may be evaluating a data model. And that's again where we just look at the different data points that we're going to look at and try to design or draw the relationships that exist between those data points. That's important for laying out each of our projects. So you can see at this point, we've looked at critical thinking, trying to identify a question. We've looked at different data sources that we might be able to use to help answer that question. Now we're looking at the data modeling on how we want to structure our data analytics project. At this point, we haven't even analyzed anything statistically or in any kind of software. It's really not till we get to the next step where we begin to see different types of data analytics. In this case, we're really focusing on basic descriptive statistics. So when we initially jump into data, we really just want to get a sense of what the data looks like. So when I do data mining early on, I'm really grabbing data and putting it into the software, and I'm really looking to see, does any kind of pattern evolve? Is there anything I need to investigate? Sometimes by putting it in and taking what I call a quick peek of the data, where I'm looking at the data visually, I just want it to come out in a graph. It enables me to see if maybe I'm missing data and I need to go investigate where I need to find values to put back into data where it was missing. Sometimes it'll show me a graph that you see here at the bottom where there's an anomaly in the data. So is that anomaly something that I would expect to see over and over, or was it truly just a one-time blip that I really don't want to have in my trend analysis when I'm looking at eliciting insight to make a recommendation for future business decisions? So when you do data mining, it really is looking at the descriptives. You're looking at the mins, the maxes, the averages, the means. We want to just visually look at which direction does it go? Does it have a direct relationship, an indirect relationship, or is it just kind of scattered all over the place? This is a really good starting point. Again, long before we ever get to the actual analytics part of any data analysis project. So once we wrap up the data mining part, that's where we want to move into what we really know as the analytics maturity model. So the descriptive statistics you see here on the left is kind of answering the question of what happened. So it kind of gives us a range of the data. So when I looked at temperature, what was the range for the 3-month period? Did it go from 49 degrees to 109 degrees? That gives me my min and my max of my data. What was the average temperature of the time I was there? Again, I can look at the mean and it might tell me that it was 82 degrees was my mean. So descriptive statistics is really where we want to start. A lot of that is looking back at historical data, trying to develop some type of pattern. As we move up the maturity model, we begin to see the diagnostic analytics. That's really where we want to answer the question, why did it happen? So we can integrate different forms of data into that and try to see if we can explain why we think something happened. Maybe it might have been a hurricane, and so the rain amounts were higher for a month than they had been historically, and so there might be additional external variables that are going to come into my model. But you can see as I begin to go up the maturity model, what I might mention is as you move up this maturity model, so does the complexity of the tool that you're going to be using. So as we move up this model, I can use some basic Excel at the bottom. When I'm all the way at the left, I can do something as simple as Excel. But as I move up this model, I'm going to be moving into systems like Python, or I might be moving into other analytics tools like Power BI. And when I get all the way to the right-hand side, that's really where it's going to require artificial intelligence or machine learning to get into the highest levels. And a lot of that is sophisticated enough that we're still in the infancy of the technology that can master things beyond prescriptive analytics. So this will require a pretty sophisticated tool, but you can see as I get from the middle of the model to the right of the model, I'm really creating more of a forecasting mentality where I'm really looking at what should I do in the future, and I'm projecting what I think the data will look like as I move forward. So we'll be using historical data, but we'll use that historical data to elicit insight on the future, where I think the future's going. There's also some additional really interesting data analytics going on now, and these are kind of evolving out of this space where we have all these emerging technologies to do some really exciting things in data analytics. So not only is it the traditional statistics type analytics that we were doing before, but now we're doing some very interesting things in text analysis. So you can analyze social media posts for specific things about a company. You can look at disclosures of your competitors for certain words, and this technology allows us to pick up this verbiage. Also, the rich media analysis is another thing that's very interesting. It's almost like when you run these models and you run this technology, it's almost getting to have a lie detector on every call or every recording. So we see companies using this a lot now with analysts. The analysts are using rich media analytics when they get to have phone calls with the managers of companies, they're running rich media analytics to see if they can garner information about the inflection that people are using in their voices to see if they think that a manager might be lying about something. That can be really interesting if we're wanting to maybe analyze customer phone calls in our customer relationship management system. If we want to intervene on employee communication, where maybe an employee is communicating with other employees or a customer, we can look at the inflections and determine what type of inflection is basically elicits the most sales. So we can analyze, when we analyze specific employees, we can determine what types of voices are customers most responsive to, which salespeople can create the most sales revenue based on different things in their voices. And so rich media analytics is just another really interesting way coming out of this. Also, we have the time series, SQL, and graph analytics. Like I said, these are really interesting ways of looking at data. A lot of that unstructured data that we didn't have a way of importing into a system before, and now we can. Now we can convert this unstructured data into something that can be analyzed. Once we get the data analyzed, so at this point, we've asked our question, we've figured out what the data is, we've gone through the process of dealing with our data, we've peeked at it, we've determined it's going to be well behaved, we've run it through our data analytics model, and we're ready to report this out to our decision makers. This is really my favorite part. It's the pretty part. It's the art. It's the artwork where I get to show you something interesting. When we get into the visualization, it really is about the storytelling. And I think the storytelling is probably the most exciting place where I get to have fun. And you can see examples of different data analytics software here that I use to elicit this kind of response or reaction with, whether it be upper level management, whether it be subordinates in a meeting, or whether I'm working with external clients. I think these types of pictures of accounting information really hit it home with our clients. Because I got to be honest with you, I'm really excited to go into a meeting with an Excel spreadsheet, but a lot of times I begin to hear crickets chirping when I pull up my spreadsheet. I'm so excited to show all my columns and rows of data. As an accountant, I love all the great things I've done behind the scenes in the cells and the computations and the different types of if-then statements that I've created, and the merging of data and all of my ability to work in Excel. And I want to show everybody how good I am in Excel. I got to be honest with you, nobody cares. But what they do get excited about is when I use that data that I have from various software or from Excel, and when I create a picture with it, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you can see in some of the pictures here, you can see that there's maps that I was able to do. So I can do heat maps and bar charts, and I can do pie charts and cascading charts. There's so many interesting ways of showing data now, and I really prefer a dashboard. What you see here is lots of different visualizations, but when you take visualizations and you couple them together and you put them all together and to make this pretty picture, putting several insights on one page is a dashboard. So that's the fun part for me, is the storytelling and the data visualization part. But we can't forget, when we move past data visualization and the storytelling, that we still have to consider that there's a lot of issues here that are evolving in the area of data analytics ethics. So when we move on into ethics, this part is not going away. So what we have to know is, as a society, do we really have privacy? We're constantly being surveilled. We're constantly being de-identified. We have cheap access. Every time you click away on a cookie, you're giving them access to your information. Every time you download an app to your phone, you've agreed to let them access your phone data frankly, for the ability to use their application. So do we really have the right to privacy anymore? I find every time something happens on the news anymore, I'm thinking, well, they'll catch that person right away because we know everyone has a video camera on their house anymore. So again, do we really have the right to privacy? And more importantly, do we even own our data? These are all really important questions that are going to be answered in the near future. So when I'm driving around and my phone is collecting GPS points, so whether I have my GPS turned on or not, they are able to track my phone signal by which phone towers that I'm pinging off of. So even if you don't have your GPS on your phone or on your car, you are sending out pings. And when you're on social media, if you post a picture, you are sending out pings on where that picture was taken. You're sending out information about your lifestyle when you present things in a public forum. Also, when you put things into a search engine, these are also really important things to pay attention to. Every time you search something, that goes into a history, and that's going to be searchable. So we have informed consent laws. So a lot of times you see now where you have to check mark that you agree to the cookies that you go to. Cookies just mean they're tracking the information that you have on your device. And sometimes when you look at those cookie agreements, when you look at that terms of agreement, they can sell your data. So if you belong to a frequent shopper program, so a lot of times when you go to your local grocery store, or when you use a credit card at a certain store. So if you routinely use the same credit card, that company is tracking the purchase behavior of the person associated with that credit card. Or if you have a frequent, like a frequent buyer card with someone, like I do my local grocery store, they're collecting that data about me, and that's how they know how to advertise to me. So did I provide informed consent saying they had the right to sell my data? The thing that I worry most about is when you think about how technology is used, and as we're moving, remember, along that maturity model, and we're moving into technology where there's artificial intelligence and machine learning involved, what I'm finding is that what happens when we do identify something as private. No, I don't want you having access to my social security number. I don't want you broadcasting that out to everyone. But what happens when we have data that is private, but when we use technology, we're able to triangulate? So if I use artificial intelligence, what is the ethics involved with technology creating data that we would normally define as private, but the technology didn't get the data from someone else? It coupled together data from multiple sources and inadvertently creates private data. And I'll give you an example of that. Again, I'll use the bike share. When we were working with the bike share data and we were working with that GPS information, when we were tracking where the bicycle went, and we were trying to determine whether it was public use or recreational use, we inadvertently were able to identify people's home addresses, and that was never the intent of the data. So we immediately gave the data back to the original provider because we tracked a GPS map, and it took the bicycle to people's front yards, and it collected that GPS data point. So when I took the census data and coupled it with the GPS data and then put it with the financial data, I was able to identify someone that had existed in a de-identified data set. So in the census data, they were not identified. In the financial data, they were not identified. In the GPS data, they were not identified. But when we coupled three sources of data together, we inadvertently were able to identify people. And that's what artificial intelligence and machine learning is able to do now. It's able to create private data. So what are the ethics involved with machine learning and artificial intelligence creating private data? Should we have issues with that? We also know that we're seeing a lot come out in the last couple of years during the pandemic on healthcare data. So what is our right to privacy on healthcare data? What is the right to privacy with government intelligence? We've seen a lot of information on the news and social media in the last few months, especially when it talks about going back and forth between different types of government. What is our right to privacy when we have marketing data, when we're trying to be marketed to, or when our data is being collected and sold? And so companies are making money off of our data. Do we have a right to part of the revenue generated from the sale of our personal data? And so that's where you get into the monetizing of the data. So when I'm tracking the number of people who purchase tomatoes today, Do I have a right to a portion of that monetization since I contributed to that data? These are all things that are happening in the area of ethics, and certainly an emerging field that's going on where accountants are going to be involved in auditing this function. So the great thing about data analytics is it's here to stay. It helped us evolve as a profession. It's impacting every function in accounting. Whether you decide to go into audit, you're going to be doing audit analytics. If you go into tax, there's tax analytics. For those of us on the internal side where we work for private companies, there's data analytics on the private side. You could see that example that we use with the bike share company. I'm an information systems person, so you can see I do a lot of stuff with the data modeling and helping on the front end of projects. I think it's an exciting time to be in accounting, and I can't wait for you to join our ranks.